When you think about getting a medical diagnosis, there's um, there's usually this expectation of precision. Like if you break your arm, the X-ray shows a jagged white line across the bone.
Oh, yeah, completely.
The doctor points at the film, you look at the film, and the problem is just objectively right there in front of you.
It's entirely binary, like the bone is broken or the bone is intact. And that visual evidence provides a lot of comfort because, well, we're wired to understand things we can see and easily categorize.
Exactly. But the moment you step into the world of neurodevelopment, that X-ray machine becomes practically useless. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just incredibly murky. It's a space where biology, environment, behavior, and like societal expectations all kind of collide.
Right.
So to navigate that for today's deep dive, we're going to try a slightly different dynamic. I'm going to put on the lecturer's hat to walk us through the actual mechanics of this material, and you are going to take on the role of the inquisitive student.
I love it. I am pulling up a chair and opening the metaphorical notebook. I'll be here to ask the hard questions, push back on the assumptions, and kind of figure out the broader implications for all of you listening.
Yeah.
Because neurodevelopmental conditions, I mean, they touch every community, every classroom, and just countless families.
They really do. So to ground this, we're pulling our foundational information from section 15.10 of chapter 15 from Psychology 2E.
Got it.
Our mission today is exploring neurodevelopmental disorders, specifically attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so ADHD, and autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. These are conditions diagnosed early in childhood. They involve significant developmental problems in personal, social, academic, and intellectual functioning.
Right. The early childhood part is key.
It is. But crucial to our understanding today is the fact that these conditions do not just magically evaporate when a person turns 18.
Yeah.
They often persist throughout adulthood, fundamentally altering the trajectory of a person's life.
And, you know, whether you are a parent trying to advocate for your kid or an educator managing a complex classroom or just someone trying to understand the wiring of your own brain, this deep dive will completely shatter some of the most, like, deeply ingrained cultural myths about human development.
Absolutely. So let's start by looking at ADHD. To pull this out of the clinical jargon, section 15.10 introduces a really vivid profile of a child named Diego.
Okay, tell me about Diego.
So Diego's mother describes him as coming out of the womb, kicking and screaming, and says he basically never stopped moving. He has a really sweet disposition, but he's in a perpetual state of trouble. Like, he loses his jacket 3 times a winter.
Oh, wow.
He breaks things accidentally. He simply cannot sit still. And his teachers recognize that he's smart, but his impulsivity is so relentless that he never finishes his assignments, and as a result, he isn't actually learning the material.
What's fascinating here is figuring out where the normal chaos of childhood ends and, you know, a clinical disorder begins. Because, I mean, any 5-year-old struggles with sustained attention, right? Most kids that age are impulsive and fidgety. If I'm looking at this critically as the student here, I want to know the exact threshold. What transforms standard childhood boisterousness into a definitive diagnosis of ADHD?
Okay, let's unpack this. The defining threshold is interference with normal functioning. It's not just about a child having, like, high energy. It's about a biological inability to regulate that energy to the point where it actively derails their life.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and ADHD was actually first described back in the 1920s by Hans Hofmann, who observed his own son struggling to concentrate and having to repeat simple homework endlessly just to retain it. But it wasn't formalized until 1980 with the DSM-3. The diagnosis actually relies on 2 core pillars.
Which are?
The first is constant inattention. So that means severe disorganization, destructility, and an active avoidance of tasks requiring sustained mental effort.
Right.
And the second pillar is hyperactivity and impulsivity. That's the constant fidgeting, blurting out answers, and the physical inability to, like, wait for a turn.
But interference with normal functioning still sounds a bit subjective when we're talking about a first grader losing a jacket, you know? How does that interference manifest as the stakes get higher?
Well, the textbook provides a rather chilling example of those higher stakes. It notes that adolescents and young adults with ADHD receive significantly more traffic tickets and are involved in far more automobile accidents than their peers without the diagnosis.
Wow. That takes it out of the classroom entirely.
Yeah.
You're talking about a fundamental delay in the brain's braking system playing out on a highway at 60 miles an hour. It's a complete lack of forethought and impulse control with potentially fatal consequences.
That delayed braking system is the perfect way to visualize it. And it answers the question of what happens when these children grow up. Because there's this persistent societal narrative that ADHD is just a phase, right?
Right, like a byproduct of childhood that you outgrow once you graduate high school and enter the real world. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what do the actual longitudinal outcomes look like for these individuals? What happens when hyperactive kids become adults?
First, let's look at the baseline prevalence. ADHD occurs in about 8% of children. Boys are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed than girls.
3 times. Why the huge gap?
The text notes this disparity might partially reflect the fact that boys are more prone to exhibiting aggressive and antisocial behaviors, which makes them more disruptive and therefore, more likely to get referred to psychological clinics in the first place.
Okay. That makes sense.
But regarding adulthood, for about 60% of those diagnosed as children, the ADHD persists directly into their adult lives.
Wait, a 60% retention rate.
Yeah.
That means this is definitively not just a childhood disorder.
Yeah.
If the symptoms remain, how does that untreated impulsivity and inattention compound over decades?
The long-term reality is stark. The textbook details a major longitudinal study conducted by Klein and colleagues in 2012. They tracked down adults who had been identified with ADHD symptoms back in the 1970s and compared their life outcomes to a control group without ADHD.
Okay.
The individuals with persistent, untreated ADHD faced significantly worse outcomes across virtually every metric of modern life. They had lower educational attainment, meaning they were more likely to drop out of high school and far less likely to earn a college degree.
Wow.
And this educational derailment cascaded into lower socioeconomic status. They held less prestigious jobs, earned less money, and experienced much higher rates of being fired.
Because the exact same executive dysfunction that makes a child lose their jacket and blurt out answers makes an adult lose crucial paperwork and speak inappropriately in a board meeting.
Exactly.
The environment changed, but the structural brain deficit remained.
And it deeply impacts social functioning as well. The study found these adults had fewer friendships and significantly higher divorce rates.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. And the substance abuse data is especially concerning. Childhood ADHD was found to predict later drinking problems, daily smoking, and the use of illicit drugs. And perhaps the most revealing statistic, nearly 81% of adults whose ADHD persisted had at least one other comorbid disorder.
I mean, if you're dealing with a lifetime of academic failure, job instability, and fractured relationships, it's entirely logical that you develop secondary conditions like clinical depression or severe anxiety.
Right, exactly.
The psychological toll of constantly failing to meet societal expectations would be immense. But if the outcomes are this severe and this widespread, so if the outcomes are this serious, what's the root cause? Is it really just too much sugar and bad parenting, like pop culture tells us?
The textbook takes a really hard line on debunking those assumptions. Regarding the sugar myth, the text cites a comprehensive statistical review of 16 different studies. The conclusion was definitive. Sugar consumption has zero effect on the behavioral and cognitive performance of children. None.
Zero effect. Seriously.
Yep. Zero. Food additives were shown to have a very minor effect, but nowhere near enough to act as the primary catalyst for ADHD. And poor parenting is equally dismissed by the data as a root cause.
Okay, so if we are entirely ruling out diet and discipline, we are left with biology. What is physically happening in the brain of someone with ADHD?
It's heavily genetic. We know this by looking at twin studies. The concordance rate, which is the statistical probability that if one twin has a condition, the other twin will also have it, is 0.66 for identical twins.
Okay.
For fraternal twins who only share half their DNA, that rate drops to 0.20.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that massive gap points directly to inherited genetics. Specifically, these genes are linked to the regulation of the neurotransmitter dopamine.
Okay, but dopamine is generally understood as the brain's reward chemical, right?
Yeah.
Like the thing that makes us feel good when we eat sugar or check our phones. How does a reward chemical dictate impulse control?
It's better to think of dopamine as the vital messenger that carries the stop signal in the brain. The brain's inhibition center, the brakes, is located in the frontal lobe. When you have an impulse to do something inappropriate, the frontal lobe is supposed to send a signal across a synaptic gap to suppress that action.
Right.
Dopamine is the neurotransmitter required to carry that signal across the gap. The ADHD brain has a literal deficit of dopamine activity in these crucial regions.
So the frontal lobe might be trying to hit the brakes, but without enough dopamine to carry the message, the brake line is essentially severed.
Yes, exactly.
The impulse just fires unchecked. That explains why stimulant medications like Ritalin or Adderall are so effective. By elevating dopamine activity in the brain, they aren't speeding the child up. They're finally providing the necessary chemical messenger to let the brain's braking system function.
That is exactly the mechanism. Furthermore, brain imaging actually shows structural differences. Children with ADHD often have smaller frontal lobes overall, and those areas show less activation when the child is asked to perform mental tasks. It's a physical, structural, and chemical reality. The text does point out one proven environmental trigger, which is maternal smoking and prenatal nicotine exposure. That exposure is significantly associated with the development of more severe ADHD symptoms, likely because it disrupts early fetal brain development.
Okay, but if the criteria are this strictly biological and structural, it begs a major statistical question. The textbook notes that parent-reported ADHD rates jumped 22% between just 2003 and 2007. Human DNA does not mutate that rapidly. How does the medical community explain a 22% spike in a genetic condition over a 4-year period?
Great question. The text offers 4 viable explanations for this surge. First, there's the possibility of overdiagnosis. Some doctors may be too quick to prescribe medication as a behavioral fix for children who are simply energetic, but don't actually meet the clinical threshold for interference with normal functioning. Second, there's vastly greater public awareness. Parents, teachers, and pediatricians know the specific symptoms now and actively look for them, meaning cases that would have slipped through the cracks in the 1980s are now being caught.
Sure.
Third, the actual DSM diagnostic criteria have shifted slightly over time, which may cast a wider net.
And the fourth?
The fourth explanation involves the pervasive modern use of technology: smartphones, tablets, and rapid-fire video games.
Wait, but you just established that ADHD is a structural genetic deficit in dopamine regulation. How can a smartphone cause that?
It doesn't cause the genetic disorder, but it can mimic or exacerbate the symptoms. These devices deliver constant, instant hits of stimulation. A developing brain that becomes entirely accustomed to a rapid-fire, highly stimulating digital environment may struggle immensely to adapt to a slow, understimulating environment.
Like reading a static textbook in a quiet classroom.
Exactly. The resulting behavior, the distractibility, fidgeting, inability to focus, looks clinically identical to inattention, artificially inflating the diagnosis rates.
That transition from structural biology to behavioral manifestation provides a really strong bridge into the second half of the material. Because while ADHD is largely defined by externalized hyperactive behavior, the inability to stop moving or talking, autism spectrum disorder seems to represent a profound shift toward internal differences, specifically in how a person processes social interaction and communication.
Yes, moving to ASD requires us to look at an entirely different set of developmental pathways. The history of this diagnosis starts with psychiatrist Leo Kanner. In 1943, Kanner published a seminal paper detailing what he termed early infantile autism.
Okay.
He had observed a specific group of children who exhibited a profound inability to form close emotional ties with others. They displayed severe language abnormalities and had an intense, almost overwhelming intolerance to even the most minor changes in their daily routines. The current DSM-5 definition is a highly refined extension of Kanner's initial observations.
So what are the specific clinical disturbances required for an ASD diagnosis today, and how do we differentiate it from other developmental or cognitive delays?
The textbook outlines 3 primary disturbances. The first involves severe deficits in social interaction. We're talking about early behaviors like a child actively turning their head away when spoken to, entirely avoiding eye contact, and showing zero interest in shared play. The text describes it as these children living in a personal, isolated social world that others simply cannot penetrate.
Cognitively, what creates that isolated social world?
It largely stems from an inability to process social cues that neurotypical brains decode automatically. This ties directly into the second disturbance, which is communication deficits.
How does that look in practice?
This spans a massive range. It can manifest as a complete lack of speech. It can appear as giving only robotic, one-word answers. It often involves echoed speech, where a child merely parrots back what was just said to them without understanding the conversational context. Crucially, they struggle to read nonverbal cues. A furrowed brow, a sarcastic tone, a shift in posture. These subtle signals that govern human interaction are completely missed.
I mean, if you cannot decode the nonverbal language that dictates 90% of human emotion, the social world would feel completely unpredictable and chaotic.
Which perfectly explains the third disturbance: repetitive patterns of behavior or fixated interests. To cope with a chaotic, unpredictable world, individuals with ASD often rely on rigid repetition.
Like what kind of repetition?
This can be physical, like rocking back and forth or repeatedly dropping and picking up an object. Or it can be a fixated, intense interest, such as memorizing every single engine part of a specific train model, even if that knowledge serves no practical purpose. The repetition provides control and predictability. And the textbook makes one absolutely vital distinction here. Autism spectrum disorder is not the same thing as an intellectual disability.
But they can't exist simultaneously.
Yes, they can be comorbid, but the DSM-5 explicitly states that ASD symptoms are not caused by an underlying intellectual disability. Many individuals with ASD has average or far above average intelligence. Their deficits are strictly in social processing and communication.
This raises an important question, right? The textbook uses the word spectrum. How has our definition changed, and what happened to Asperger's? For decades, the public was very familiar with the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. What prompted the psychiatric community to drop Asperger's and consolidate everything under the autism spectrum disorder umbrella?
So in previous editions of the DSM, Asperger's was classified as a distinct, generally less severe form of autistic disorder. People diagnosed with Asperger's usually had average or high intelligence and strong, sometimes advanced vocabularies.
Right.
However, they still exhibited the core social interaction impairments. They might have an incredibly advanced vocabulary, but could only use it to talk at length about their one specific fixated interest, completely missing the social cue that the person they were talking to was bored or, trying to leave.
So why remove the specific label if it accurately described a particular presentation of symptoms?
Because clinical research failed to demonstrate that Asperger's was qualitatively different from autistic disorder. It wasn't a different mechanism in the brain. It was just a different magnitude of the exact same underlying condition. It's a quantitative difference, not a qualitative one.
Yeah.
Therefore, the spectrum model was adopted to acknowledge that the severity of these three core disturbances varies wildly from person to person.
From a clinical standpoint, recognizing it as a continual spectrum makes sense, but redefining a diagnosis usually causes significant friction in the real world.
Oh, it caused absolute panic. The textbook notes that parents of children with Asperger's were terrified that by losing this specific label, their children would no longer meet the clinical criteria required to receive vital special education services and state-funded support. It highlights how purely clinical decisions in a textbook have massive, tangible impacts on the survival resources of families.
And the urgency for those resources is only growing. The rates of ASD have seen a dramatic, well-documented rise.
The numbers are staggering. The text cites a 273% increase in reported cases in California between 1987 and 1998. Current estimates place the prevalence at roughly 1 in 59 children, and it is 4 times more common in boys than in girls.
When you have a 273% spike in a developmental disorder, it creates a vacuum of understanding. And human beings will rush to fill that vacuum with whatever explanation they can find, which leads to intense public speculation and misinformation. Based strictly on the scientific evidence in the text, what actually causes ASD?
The primary driver is genetics. The identical twin concordance rate for ASD is between 60 and 90%. Yeah, that implies a massive genetic vulnerability. Researchers have implicated many different genes, but specifically, they point to genes responsible for the formation of synaptic circuits. These are the intricate neurological highways that facilitate communication between different specialized areas of the brain. If the genetic blueprint for these circuits is altered, the brain regions that process visual information, like seeing a face, cannot properly wire together with the regions that process emotional context.
So the biological hardware is structurally incapable of running the software required for complex social interaction?
Exactly.
Are there environmental triggers that interact with that genetic vulnerability?
Yes. The text identifies several environmental factors thought to trigger these genetic mutations during early development, including exposure to certain pollutants, urban residency, and maternal vitamin D deficiency.
We have to ask about vaccines. What does the evidence actually say about the MMR vaccine and autism? This is probably the most controversial public theory out there.
The textbook approaches this incredibly methodically, maintaining strict, impartial adherence to the facts. The controversy stems from a paper published in a prestigious medical journal in the late 1990s. The article claimed to have found a direct link between the MMR, so measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, and the onset of autism. It sparked an international panic.
But the scientific community eventually dismantled that paper, didn't they?
Completely. The text describes it as a shocking turn of events for the medical community. The journal fully retracted the article years later after evidence surfaced proving outright fraud and highly unethical practices by the lead researcher. The data was essentially fabricated to support the conclusion.
But a retraction in a medical journal doesn't unring the bell in the public consciousness.
It does not. The media reporting had already established the fear. The text notes that recent surveys show roughly a third of parents still express concern about a link between vaccines and autism. More concerning for public health, more than 10% of parents of young children either intentionally delay or refuse vaccinations entirely due to this fear.
That's huge.
Yeah. There was an entire industry of celebrity books and talk show appearances validating this panic.
Yeah.
But the textbook is absolute on this point. There is zero valid scientific evidence that a link exists.
To definitively prove a negative like that, you need robust data.
Yeah.
How did the scientific community isolate vaccines from the development of autism?
The text highlights a brilliant 2013 study by DiStefano and colleagues. Look at figure 15.19 in the text. They recognized that the fear was based on the sheer number of vaccines children receive early in life. Vaccines contain immunogens, which are the specific substances that trigger the immune system to build antibodies.
Okay.
So DiStefano's team analyzed the medical histories of 256 children with ASD and compared them to 752 control children without ASD. They meticulously calculated the total cumulative number of immunogens every single child received during their first 2 years of life.
Why focus specifically on the first 2 years?
Because that is the window when the childhood vaccination schedule is heaviest. And it's also the exact developmental window when the behavioral symptoms of autism typically begin to manifest.
And what did the comparison reveal?
It completely severed the link. The results demonstrated that the total quantity of immunogens received during those critical first 2 years had absolutely no relationship to the development of autism spectrum disorder. The data for the children with ASD and the neurotypical control children were practically identical.
If the methodology is that clear and the original paper was proven fraudulent, why does the myth persist with such ferocity?
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's rooted in a deeply ingrained psychological flaw in how human beings process information, illusory correlation. We're biologically wired to find patterns to survive. When two events happen close together in time, our brains automatically assume causation.
Right.
Children receive a significant cluster of vaccines around their first and second birthdays. This is the exact same chronological age when the brain is supposed to be hitting major social and communicative milestones.
So a parent takes their toddler to the pediatrician for a shot, and a month later, they notice the child isn't making eye contact or responding to their name.
Exactly.
The human brain connects the needle to the behavioral shift, even though the genetic mutation was present long before the shot was given.
Precisely. It is an incredibly powerful illusion. Like the ADHD sugar myth, it provides a simple explanation for a complex disorder. Psychologically, it offers a tangible villain. It is much easier for a grieving, confused parent to direct their anger at a physical syringe or a pharmaceutical company than it is to accept the invisible, uncontrollable reality of a genetic mutation in synaptic circuits. The internet then magnifies this misinformation, creating echo chambers that make it impossible for parents to separate rigorous science from emotional anecdotes.
Stepping back to look at this entirely, stepping out of the student role for a second here, the through line connecting all this material is striking. Whether we are examining the relentless hyperactivity of ADHD and its lifelong impact on executive function, or the internal social isolation caused by ASD, we are looking at conditions rooted in profound biological reality.
Absolutely.
Both ADHD and ASD are highly heritable neurodevelopmental conditions. We are talking about dopamine deficits, structural frontal lobe differences, and genetic mutations in synaptic pathways. We are not talking about bad parenting, sugar rushes, or fraudulent vaccine theories.
That biological reality is the most important takeaway from this text. Whether you are navigating these diagnoses yourself or interacting with neurodivergent individuals in your community, recognizing the physical mechanics of these conditions is what allows us to foster genuine, actionable empathy. When we recognize that a child isn't willfully ignoring a teacher, but rather lacking the dopamine required to hit the brakes on an impulse, we stop punishing the behavior and start treating the deficit. When we understand the neurological isolation of ASD, We stop forcing neurotypical social expectations onto brains that are wired entirely differently. Empathy built on accurate science leads to better, earlier interventions, which we know from the data can fundamentally alter a person's lifelong trajectory for the better.
Which forces us to think about how these definitions will evolve going forward.
And that is the final thought I want to leave you to ponder based on the text. The textbook notes that diagnostic rates are climbing. Part of this is because our mental health professionals are better equipped to identify even subtle cases.
Right, sharper tools.
Exactly. But simultaneously, we're living in a society completely saturated by attention-fracturing technology that mimics and exacerbates these very symptoms. So as our understanding of the brain's circuitry becomes increasingly granular, and as our society continues to change, will the spectrum of these disorders eventually broaden so much that we have to fundamentally redefine what a normal neurodevelopmental brain even looks like? Or are we slowly realizing that the idea of a standard universal human brain was always just an illusion?